To another episode of Miller's Movers. Again, a slightly quiet one this week because the weather is rather spoiling our fun. Lots of racing going by the wayside. We did have some interesting racing this weekend, and we'll get to that in a minute. But first, we probably should look at some Cheltenham entries that have come out this morning. Entries for the big hurdle races, the Champion Hurdle, the Mares Hurdle, and the Stayers Hurdle. Perhaps not a huge amount of excitement around these, but in the Champion Hurdle, Constitution Hill stands his ground. That's good to see. He's clearly still got 4 legs in working order at Seven Barrows. The 2 mares, the Will They Won't They mares, Bright Days Ahead and Lossiemouth, hold entries, and they also hold entries in the Mares Hurdles. Perhaps the interesting omission is Mystical Power. He doesn't have an entry in the Champion Hurdle. Sir Gino does. It's interesting. Why is he in there? Is that he in there as a backup for Constitution Hill if something goes wrong with Constitution Hill between now and Cheltenham? Sir Gino will drop back to hurdles and take his chance in Champion Hurdle, or is he in there if anything goes wrong in his next run, which is intended on being the Game Spirit chase at Newbury? I would be surprised if they don't now commit to this chasing campaign unless something went drastically wrong in his next chase start. I can't see that you would necessarily fancy going back to the Champion Hill. If Constitution Hill came out, I think that increased the chance of Bright Days Ahead and Lossiemouth running there. Why would you take Sergino back to hurdles? Surely you just plough on now with your chase plan, given he jumped so brilliantly on his chase debut. State Man is in there. Just talking to Alex now before hitting record, he made a really good point. State Man won the Champion Hurdle last year at a price of 2 to 5, and he's now around about 8 to 1. Has there ever been a horse that's gone off a bigger price or a bigger price differential from winning at such short odds to going off, presumably going to be fairly long odds, to defend his title at the Cheltenham Festival? I couldn't think of one. If you can, drop it in the comments, let me know. I'd be interested to hear if you've got better trivia knowledge than me. And then just one other really interesting addition to the entries is All the World from Japan. Now, he's really interesting. I don't think he's got a chance. His flat form is pretty moderate. He was 3rd in the Tokyo high jump, so he's not even theoretically Japan's best hurdler. But the very fact that Japan are entertaining sending a horse over is potentially really exciting for the jumps game. The Japanese faculty have certainly added plenty to the flat game in the last few years. They're on their quest to try and win the Arc de Triomphe. They add plenty. Hugely excitable crowds, and they're very passionate about the sport. The fact they could potentially start to get into British, Irish jumps racing and challenge some of these bigger races is really exciting for the sport in a time where growth is definitely needed. The Mares Hurdle, nothing really exciting to report here. As I said, both Bright Days Ahead and Lossiemouth hold an entry in this. If we're to believe connections, and I think we shouldn't really sort of look to see that they're trying to pull the wool over eyes, it does look very much like Lossiemouth is intending to go to the Champion Hurdle. Willie Mullins has told us this is a 2-year plan, that the plan was after the Triumph to go to the Mares Hurdle last year and then the Champion Hurdle this year. That still looks on. I think they feel they had excuses at Kempton last time. With Brighter Days Ahead, we're being told the opposite. We're being told that her intended target is the Mares Hurdle. The O'Learys, Gordon Elliott, all saying when you go to Cheltenham, you want to win the easiest possible race, and they feel that the Mares Hurdle gives Bright Days Ahead the best chance there. She was, of course, beaten in the Mares Novice last year. Perhaps got tactics wrong. It was fairly slowly run. It turned into a sprint, and she's clearly a very strong stayer at this trip, and she would be a strong stayer at the Mares trip of 2 mile 4 as well. And then the stayers, the usual suspects: Tihupu, Home by the Lee, Langadan, who presumably will show a bit more in the spring than he's shown through the winter. Lucky Place, who was pretty impressive on his last outing at Cheltenham, looks like he'll step up for going up in trip. Crambo, who won his 2nd long-distance hurdle at Ascot. Mystical Power does have an entry in the Stayers Hurdle. That would be a big step up in trip, but there's plenty of stamina on the dam side. Annie Power, his dam went very close in the Stayers Hurdle herself. So he might be potentially interesting. It might help his jumping, going a gear slower at championship pace. And Hewitt, who was going really well in the Gold Cup when coming down a couple of years ago. So strong stayer at this trip. Not always the biggest. Sometimes his jumping can be found a bit wanting in that top class grade, I think, around Cheltenham. He would perhaps be an interesting one. The two that are really surprising to me is Ahoysignor nor Corbett's Cross have an entry. And I just don't quite understand when you've got a chaser of their calibre, and they are seriously good chasers, perhaps just shy of Gold Cup standard, why you wouldn't at least give them entry in this, given that I think the division is fairly weak. Perhaps the most interesting one at this stage is July Flower for the Stayers Hurdle. She made a really impressive Irish debut for Henry de Bromhead and Robka at Leopardstown over the Christmas period, beat Carla Conti pretty comfortably. It's 4 lengths. She was getting £5, but she was well on top at the end and drawing away. She has some really good French form, including 3rd in the French Champion Hurdle at Auteuil. That's over 3 mile 2. She's a strong stayer. She can be a bit buzzy apparently, so maybe the mare's hurdle would be a better route for her over a slightly shorter trip, a slightly stronger, earlier pace. But if she were to go in this, she's currently around about 25 to 1 or bigger. I wouldn't put her up as an anti-post bet, but I certainly think of the entries in there at the moment, she's the most interesting, given that I'm not a huge fan of Home by the Lead, T Hooper, and the sort of usual guard. As for the champion hurdle, I mean, if you were looking for an anti-post bet, where do you find one? You can't entertain backing Constitution Hill. Much as I love him at this stage, he is clearly a difficult horse to train these days. There's a chance he won't get there. State Man, I just don't think you can fancy him. He was well put in his place by Brighter Days Ahead. For all that probably wasn't his running, but he's been proven to be inferior to Constitution Hill. Lossymouth, it's probably the only one you could really fancy, because if you take it at face value, she's going there, and you believe that Kempton didn't play to her strengths and she'll be better again at Cheltenham in the champion hurdle. She perhaps be the play. You couldn't back Bright Days Ahead because they've told you she's not going there. And if they prove to be right and she goes to the mare's hurdle, you'd feel pretty daft, I suggest, for punting her for the champion hurdle at this stage, given that she probably won't go off an awful lot shorter, even if she did line up. So perhaps not a huge amount of angles for the anti-post punting in these three hurdle races at the moment, but that might well change. And it'll just be interesting to see how Sergino gets on in the game spirit. That would harden him on the route for the Arkle. If something went wrong, maybe Nicky Henson would consider being double-handed in the champion hurdle. The weekend review now, and this will be pretty brief because there wasn't a huge amount to get excited about. Foss Lass, remarkably, was the track in the UK that beat the weather. I mean, that would have been long odds on, I would have thought, at the start of the year, for Foss Lass to be the only card on the day that survives the weather, given it often gets rained off. But we were lucky to get that on. I thought there were two interesting performances from there. The first was Juby Ball in the maiden hurdle for Evan Williams, Adam Wencher and the Ruckers. He looked like a really nice big galloping sort. He doesn't do anything very quickly. He's got a big action. I would suggest that soft ground is going to be essential to him, but he drew right away in the closing stages of that maiden hurdle. Ludor, the runner-up, had already set a decent standards, rated around about 118, was readily brushed aside. He hasn't got any fancy entries. He's got no big targets, I should think, and typical with Evan Williams, he'd be brought along slowly. But I really like what he did. And his bumper form, again, holds up to scrutiny. Again, he didn't do an awful lot very quick in a bumper. He was beaten by 6 Mile Bridge, who was probably just a quicker horse and had more acceleration when they met in the bumper. But Juby Ball, I thought, was quite impressive for a maiden hurdle at Foss Lass. I wouldn't be at all surprised if he stepped up to be a decent chaser in time. I don't expect him to do anything particularly fancy over hurdles this season. But he's gone into my tracker, and I'll persist with him until I see him over a fence. The feature race at Foss Lass was the Tautan, rerouted from Wetherby, and it was a good performance by the Ben Pauling trained handstands to land this. Ben Pauling's keeping his string in remarkably good form. He's been pretty consistent throughout, but I wouldn't get too excited about the form of this race. It sort of fell apart. Sherry Dam, who was his market rival, she really failed to fire. She was weakening quite drastically turning in, and arguably could have been pulled up when falling 2 out. That also saw the fall of St Davy, pretty heavy fall, who then hampered and caused Hillcrest to unseat Sam Twiston Davis. St Davy was coming off second best behind handstands, as he had done previously at Sandown. You would have thought that maybe with a bit of chase experience behind him, he might have closed the gap, but I think he was going to be beaten around about the same distance, or maybe even further on this occasion. Hillcrest, he's disappointing. He was a really good novice hurdler a good few seasons ago. He's been off with injury. He's a giant horse. And it is just proof, this adage that a horse looks like a chaser is so misplaced. Yes, power is a very valuable asset in a chaser, but intelligent footwork and an ability to adjust themselves is arguably more important, if not certainly equally important. And Giant Hillcrest, I think it's just a long way from his brain to his feet. He can't get himself organised. He again had jumped pretty scrappily before unseating Sam Twiston Davis, which in fairness wasn't his fault. So I think they're going to have to go back to the drawing board with Hillcrest. St Davy doesn't really look good enough. The runner-up, Lord of Thunder for the Tizzards, I put him up as a novice chaser to follow at the start of the season. He'd been a little bit disappointed. I thought he was running a good race on chase debut at Cheltenham, and he came down. It was one of those typical runs where you wonder that Joe Tizzard didn't go away and scratch his head as to quite why he'd run a novice at Cheltenham first time out. It does take a little bit of jumping. That might have knocked his confidence because he was a bit disappointed next time out. This was more like it. He was well beaten by handstands, but he was entitled to be well beaten. given the golf in their ratings. He's still now a pound below his hurdle mark. He was a decent hurdle. He won twice around Wincanton on heavy ground, really impressively. I think flat track, right-handed might be where he's at his best. And if this has got his confidence together off this mark of 128, which, like I said, is a pound below his hurdle mark, he'd still be a horse that I'd be interested in following. And with a bit of confidence, he might yet prove to be a better chase than hurdler, as I suspected he would. As for handstands, he's got this grade 2-1, good bit of placing by Ben Pauling, good ride by Ben Jones. I still don't feel that handstands is completely confident over his fences. He did look a little bit guessy at times, and I think in a more genuine grade 2 with a bit of depth to it, he might be found wanting. So it's not a form line I'll get overly carried away. And then on Sunday, of course, the big talking point was Salvator Mundi and his performance or lack of performance in the Moscow Flyer. And I think this sort of exemplifies that on a quiet news week when there's not an awful lot of racing, perhaps we'll get a bit bored and get a bit polarised. And it would appear that we have to decide here and now whether Salvator Mundi is going to win the Supreme or whether he's not. You're either with him or you're against him. We had people with stopwatches pointing out that it was a pretty moderate performance, which I think we could all see that. But I viewed it generally in a positive light. I'm not saying I want to back him at his current price around about 7-2 for the Supreme Novices Hurdle, but the Supreme is a race that I have no real opinion yet. I think it's a very weak division. Salvator Mundi got plenty wrong. He didn't jump very well. He was pretty free through the early stages, and those two things combined together, because he was free, Paul Townend has to keep a very strong hold of his head to stop him going faster than he wants. And when you do that, you are effectively restricting a horse to a hurdle, because if you want long athletic jumps, you have to be fairly releasing of your hand to allow the horse to stretch its head and its neck and its back to make those lengths over the hurdles. Paul Townend couldn't do that because he had then got run off with, so he had to take the option to sort of slightly strangle Salvator Mundi to the hurdles, not let him be too exuberant. And then when that happened, Salvator Mundi got very disorganised to the hurdles, bunny hopped a few, clattered a few, just didn't jump very well at all. He then got positioned a little bit further back than was ideal, and I thought it was to his testament he was able to come round the field and win and quicken up in quite good fashion. Yes, you'd like to have seen him won by further. Quite what he's beaten is open to debate, but I wouldn't just be keen to completely dismiss him as a Supreme Novice horse just at the moment, given we don't quite know what's going to come out. I think the one interesting angle from this race is whether the Skeltons would now consider putting the new Lion into the Supreme. We've been told all along that he's going to go for the 2 mile 5 race, the Turners. He won the Challow in impressive fashion. He clearly stays very well, but this is starting to look like a very weak Supreme. He showed plenty of pace and acceleration in the Challow Hurdle. The one caveat in that is that Darren Yates, who sold him, said in his interview with Nick Luck that he's got a sort of a bonus with the new Lion, and he's backed him quite heavily for Cheltenham. And I presume by that they mean the Turners, whether he's covered himself with the Supreme. And it might just be that it's sort of a gentleman's agreement between JP McManus, the new owner, that the Turners is where he'll go because Mr. Yates hasn't got his money on for the Supreme. But if he was mine and it was a free card to play with, I would be seriously thinking of dropping the new Lion back in trip into the Supreme, which, like I said, looks like a pretty weak division. But Salvator Mundi, I'm not saying to back him Ante-post. He's no value whatsoever at the moment, but I wouldn't just dismiss him out of hand. I think you've got to wait and see what comes out now at the Dublin Racing Festival and between now and then in the UK. And it could just be that Salvator Mundi, on his performance from the Triumph last year, which was his UK debut, he's got that form with Sergino, which, of course, Adam told us last week not to take too literally, but it was still a decent line of form. That might just be good enough on better ground in a stronger run race where he perhaps relaxes a bit more and jumps a bit better. He might yet be good enough for the Supreme. So don't take a polarised opinion is my opinion. Try and sit in the middle, sit on your hands, wait a minute, see how this picture develops, and make a decision when you need to. You don't get paid extra for backing the winner this far out at 7-2. If he goes off 7-2 on the day, you get 7-2 both times. So just take a bit of patience with the Supreme picture, and it will develop, I'm sure, in the next few weeks. Despite the dearth of racing last week, there are a few handicap moves and shakers that I thought were of note. If you're new to this series this year, the handicap adjusts the marks on a Tuesday morning. They go up early on the BHA site. So one of my interesting mornings, get a cup of coffee, and if I'm lucky, a French pastry, have a look through and see if there's anything of interest. And despite there being a little racing, there were a few that stood out. First of all, we'll start with horses going up, and the first one is Tom Doniphon. He's been really well placed by Philip Hobson Johnson White, who are having a really good season. He's won his first 2 handicaps, and it was a clever bit of placing. His first one was a conditional jockey's handicap. That meant he was able to run 9 days later without a penalty before his mark had been readjusted. He won that very comfortably at Taunton, and it was a decent race. The runner-up Sorcerer had looked pretty good himself in winning 2 back-to-back. You would perhaps say that the Paul Nicholls yard aren't absolutely firing at the moment, but Tom Doniphon's gone up £8 to a mark of 120. I don't think that will stop him. He was well on top at the end. He'll improve for going up in trip. And I would also point out that the Hobbs and Johnson White yard have worked really well using conditioned jockeys this year, particularly Callum Pritchard, who's good value for his £7. That will soon become 5. But I wouldn't be at all surprised to go back, put a condition on just to play around with his weight. And I think as he steps up in trip, he'll beat a decent horse. And he looks like a nice animal, well balanced, good jumper. He'll make up to into a smart chaser in time. The next one going up is Lord of Thunder, up £1, like I mentioned, to a mark of 128. This was a big step forward in the Toten at Fosslas over the weekend. And if you can build on that, he was a really good hurdle last year in the West Country, around places like Wincanton. I would expect him to be able to pick up from here on in, provided Joe Tizard can keep his stable in form. They do often tend to drop off from sort of the end of January onwards, so keep an eye on that in terms of yard form. But Lord of Thunder still handicapped to win off £1 lower than his hurdle mark, off a new mark of 128. And then there's a few that I thought we'd just drop back to that went up in the handicap over Christmas. The first was Thomas Moore. He won on Wincanton on Boxing Day. He was flagged up as a novice chaser to follow this year, but he obviously hadn't come back to form in time. He had a 650-day layoff. They were going to give him a spin over hurdles in a per temps qualifier at Wincanton, and he won it very comfortably indeed. He's got £6 now to a mark of 144, but he looked pretty impressive. And I would suggest that given he's a really nice animal, it would be a slight waste to lose his novice tag at this stage of the season. So I would expect them to keep him to hurdles. He is an 8-year-old, but I would expect him to stay to hurdles. And his hurdle form is working out well. He was 6 lengths behind Stay Away Faye in the Albert Bartlett 2 years ago. That looked like a decent bit of form, and the ground was too soft for him there. He is a horse that's far better on a sound surface. And his last win at Ascot, when beating Loop de Molde and It's So Fury, that's worked out really well as well. He thumped them pretty convincingly. They're both off higher marks now. So though he's up £6 to a mark of 144, it might just be that given a sound surface at Cheltenham, he could play a hand in the Perteps final, and he's certainly a horse that I will again perhaps be mentioning to you next season as a novice chaser to follow after an extra season over hurdles. Some scope for Richard Hobson. He was really impressive in winning the Roland Merrick. It wasn't fully plain sailing. They had Callum Pritchard booked to ride him and claim £4 in his £7 claim, and then he woke up Boxing Day and perhaps had a mince pie or one too many on Christmas Day and couldn't do the weight. So they managed to get Charlie Maggs last minute from Donald McCain's yard. Charlie Maggs never ridden a chase winner. I'm not sure Richard Hobson let Carl Hinchley, the owner, know that before jockeying him up, but it went to plan. Charlie Maggs rode like he'd win the 100 when his over fences. He rode beautifully, rode him a bit more prominently than some scope he'd ridden through the early part of this season. I think he sulked at Cheltenham on his first start when dropped right out, jumped beautifully, was well on top, shot clear going down to the last, and I think he was just idling in the closing stage, which allowed Quendo Cueto to get closer. The handicap has put him up £4 for a mark of 128. I don't think that's going to stop this horse. He's a strong stayer. He certainly looked better for being ridden a little bit more forward. And I'm sure off this mark of 128, there's another good handicap to be on with him this season. And then he might even step up into marathon trips next season. And then the final one is Mr. Hope Street. He's been mentioned on here plenty of times. He's gone up £2 for being beaten at Newbury over the Christmas period, up to a mark now of 126. I don't often like putting horses up that have gone up in the handicap when they've been beaten, but I think Mr. Hope Street's got mitigated circumstances. He bumped into a very well ridden and a very well handicapped Jipko at Newbury. Jipko was having his first start for a winged op. It clearly worked the oracle because he flashed home off a far lower mark than he'd been competing off last season. Mr. Hope Street, he's climbed the handicap steadily this season. That was his 4th run of the season. He's run really competitively in all of them, and I think he's ready now for a step up to 3 miles or slightly softer ground over 2 mile 4. He just got a little bit outpaced by a speedier horse at Newbury, but I wouldn't be giving up on him. I think there's still plenty of races to be won with him for the Skeltons and the Noel Feely Racing Syndicate. Nothing of interest coming down in the handicap this week, but there was one non-mover that was of interest, and that was Jukebox Joker for Edmund Williams, ridden by Isabel Williams at Foss Lass. second handicap start over 2 mile 4 and showed a little bit more. Had been very keen running over 2 miles in novice and maiden hurdles and was again the same over 2 mile 4 and first handicap start at Foss Lass about a month ago, where he made fairly moderate progress into a well-beaten fourth. Last time out, he was slightly more settled. He was again dropped out to the rear of the field. The race wasn't run at a particularly strong tempo, which meant turning in, it turned into rather a dash, and he just didn't really have the speed. But right inside the closing half furlong, he stayed on pretty nicely under a fairly strong ride from Isabel Williams in the closing stages. He looks like a horse that once he's learnt to settle will stay a lot further than 2 mile 4. Soft ground clearly suits him. He's only got a mark of 80. You're not going to see him winning on a Saturday, but in the midweek around the likes of Foss Lass, 3 miles on soft ground, Jukebox Joker certainly showed enough last time to suggest that a mark of 80 is well within range. And then to finish with 2 new entries, and both of these are mares. The first is the Venetia Williams trade Epinephrine. She's an ex-French mare. She'd been an open mark of 109. She had about 425 days off before making her UK debut in a listed hurdle race at Sandown for Venetia Williams. That was a pretty decent run. She finished 6 lengths behind Honky Tonk Highway. That mare's rated 119. She then went a month later to Taunton, ran against the boys, was a little bit outclassed, really. But I would point out as well that Venetia Williams, having had that really hot November and December, her form has dropped off a cliff rather in this turn of the year. She's 8% winners to runners this month, and she's without a winner now in the last 14 days. So I think that would perhaps go some way to explain the slightly subpar run of Epinephrine the last time out. But she's been given this mark of 109, and she just is really interesting on that one piece of form at Sandown behind Honky Tonk Highway, and also on her French form. She made her debut at Auteuil. She was beaten 7 lengths by a mare that's since gone on to win a Grade 2 and has got a rating in France of 70 kilograms. Generally, you would just double that to work out the potential French rating. So 140 for the horse that beat her 7 lengths. Now, of course, horses will improve, and it's very feasible that mare has improved significantly on a second start to land that Grade 2, and that Epinephrine, having been off for 425 days, has perhaps regressed. But even so, there's enough there from that run at Sandown, that run in France, to make her of interest off a mark of 109. I'll be waiting to see if Venetia can bounce back to a little bit of form. She often gets going again in February, but if not, I certainly won't be taking this mare at my tracker next season. I think a mark of 109, she'll certainly be winning races, and Venetia very often does well with her French mares going over fences. And then the final one is Jasmine Bliss for Harry Derham. She had really good bumper form. She was a winner of 2 of her 3 bumpers last season, made a good hurdling debut at Lingfield. She was sent off odds on, but she finished second, beaten just a length, giving a pound to Holloway Queen. Holloway Queen has since gone on to win a listed hurdle at Haydock. She's now rated 127. Jasmine Bliss was well backed to make it second time lucky, but she ran no sort of race at all at Foss Lass. It was simply too bad to be true. She was beaten in the region of 25 lengths. She's definitely better than that. The handicapper has given her a mark. I was perhaps surprised to see him go for a mark after just 2 runs. I think it would have been reasonable for him to ask to see her one more time, but he's given her a mark of 118. If you take the view that her Lingfield run was more like what she's capable of, and that Foss Lass was just too bad to be true, on that form of being beaten a length, giving a length to Holloway Queen, who's now rated 127, I would suggest a mark of 118 is fairly workable, and Harry Derham is excellent at not wasting these handicap marks. He'll certainly come up with a plan for this mare, and I'll be following her wherever she goes next. So that's it for a slightly shortened episode of Miller's Movers. Hopefully the weather will start to play ball now for the rest of this week, so we get to see the anticipated clash between John Bon and Enegamine and the Clarence House chase from Ascot. In the meantime, enjoy your week. I'll be back same time next week, where we'll also have the entries for the novice hurdles at Cheltenham, so plenty to talk about. So I'll see you then.